Howdy folks. Today we're going to talk about two concepts that are kind of intertwined, but they're both very important for JavaScript: scope and closures. So what is scope? Well, scope refers to the context and variables available at a certain part in the code. Like, what is the state of the system? What variables are available to us? Scope is tied heavily to context and closures. Scope, as you can see here, is an example of this code. If we look at line 3, or the purple stuff here, all the code involved in here, this is the outer scope. This is the outermost scope. Outer variable is in scope there. In the dark purple, that's the getGreeting function. That's a different scope. Inner variable is in scope there. When we say a variable is out of scope, it means that the scope in which that variable exists is no longer valid. We're no longer executing that code. So for instance, as soon as we stop executing getGreeting here, we would say the inner variable has gone out of scope. It is no longer in scope for the current code. Then you've got your final scope, which is green, and that's the innermost scope. So in each case here, each one of these is running in a different context. And this can change also if you're running these things and calling a function as part of a class. Then the context will also change depending on what scope you're in. So there is scope also as well within conditionals and for loops, but that's a little less complicated than functions, so that's why I'm mostly covering functions here. So then, what is a closure? A closure is what we call the variables in context that get passed along from parent to child scope. So when a new function is created, not when it is executed, but when it is created, all the variables that are in scope at that time become its closure. That includes any variables that were part of the parent closure. That might sound really confusing, so we're going to go over an example. So bringing back this code, we have on the side here what is in each scope, and then what is in the active closure. The active closure will be basically everything that is in scope for whatever line we're currently executing. So we start on line 3. Outer variable equals hello. At this point, outer variable is created. It is in the light purple scope, and it is part of the active closure because it's in the closure that we're executing. We go to line 5, since line 4 is blank. getGreeting is created and put into scope of light purple. It is also put into the active closure because we just created it. We skip lines 6 through 14 because that's all part of the getGreeting function, and we drop down to line 15 when we actually execute getGreeting. At this point, when we're executing getGreeting, greeting function has not actually been created yet because JavaScript executes the right-hand side of the equals before it actually creates a variable. So the next line we're gonna hit is line 6. At this point now, we've created inner variable, and you can see that is on dark purple scope. That is not in scope for light purple because it's inside here. But now look at the closure. When we're at line 6, our active closure has inner variable because we just defined it, but it also has outer variable and getGreeting. Why? Well, because when getGreeting was created, when we executed line 5, it took the closure of its parent, which had outer variable and getGreeting. Fun fact as well, if you add more elements into scope, that scope is dynamic. And so if I call getGreeting again, like maybe 30 lines down, greeting function would also be part of that closure. But we'll get to that. So the active closure in this case, what is available at line 6 is everything that was available in the light purple scope because that's when it was created, and also inner variable. All right, so moving on, we hit line 8. Which doesn't change anything. We're not making any new things, but that returns this new anonymous function, which we're not executing. So the next thing we do is we leave getGreeting. And we come back to line 15, we create greeting function. Now, the light purple scope has greeting function and outer variable and getGreeting because we just created greeting function. Dark purple still has inner variable. the active closure no longer has inner variable. Inner variable has gone out of scope. Why? Because we're back up to the top level now. We're executing line 15, and inner variable was only valid in lines 6 through 12. That's the only place that that inner variable can actually be referenced. So we can't reference it anymore on line 15. That's the scope. That's how we've managed to pull, we've said it's gone out of scope because we've shifted. Okay, so now we jump down to line 17. Nothing has happened except we're about to call greeting function. What is greeting function? Greeting function is the closure, or not the closure, the anonymous function from line 8 to 12. How do we know that? Because that's what getGreeting returned. So it returned this function, and now we're going to execute it. We hit line 9. Now we've got, in our green scope, we created greeting. But look at what the closure has available. It was able to borrow from its parent's closure, which had these 4 variables: outer function, getGreeting, greeting function, and inner variable, and it adds its own. So the more deeper you go into one of these, the more complicated and more available the closure becomes. And that's why we're able to use outer variable and inner variable as part of this greeting, because they are part of the active closure that this function has access to. Now we come down here, nothing has changed, we console log, we come back out. And notice now again the active closure is shifted back to the light purple scope, which doesn't have anything above it. So it doesn't have access to inner variable, it doesn't have access to greeting anymore, because it is, those variables are no longer in scope. So let's take a look at a little example of why you might want to do this. All right. So here we have a very simple index. We have create employee that we're pulling in from the employee file. We'll look at that in a little bit. And we've got employee 1, create employee Bob, we're logging it. Employee 2, create employee Jenny, and we're logging it. Okay, so let's just run this and see what happens. Well, you notice that each of these employees, in addition to having a name, also has an ID. So Bob has an ID of 1, Jenny has an ID of 2. How are we doing that? Well, let's take a look at employee.js. Create employee is a function that takes in a name. All right, let's actually put these side by side. It takes in a name, and then it returns ID, next ID, plus plus, which is post increment. What that means is that the value of ID as it currently is gets put into ID, and then we increment next ID. It creates an object with ID and name, and then it returns it. Next ID is part of create employee's closure, because when create employee was created on line 3, next ID was in scope. And so next ID now will always be in the closure of create employee, which means that we can have it out here and keep that variable and have it increment every single time. This is useful for a lot of reasons, especially when you have a function that you're creating as a callback function, for instance. It will have access to the closure and the scope of when it was created, not when it's executed. So you can have a bunch of variables, pass in a callback function somewhere, and that callback function can access those variables just like it was executing in the same scope. So this has been scope and closures. It can be kind of a confusing topic, but it's kind of integral to how JavaScript works. So if you have any questions, please let me know, and I'll see you all in class.